One of the most enduring images of the last 6 months for me is the solitary figure of Pope Francis in St Peter's Square in the height of the lockdown in Italy. He was offering a blessing and a prayer for the city of Rome, but also for the whole world. It was a moment of beautiful spiritual leadership, not just for Catholics, but for the world in the midst of the crisis that we've all been living through. The papacy is one of the distinguishing features of Catholicism, as it distinguishes us from what other Christians believe. So it's important to understand where we get the idea of the papacy from and what the role of the Pope is. Today's Gospel's a really important source for this understanding, but importantly, so is the first reading from the book of Isaiah. So let's look at some of the reasons today about why we have a Pope. And importantly, I want you to notice that it comes from the Bible. Sometimes people argue that the papacy is a medieval invention, something from the 12th or 13th centuries. But the argument for the Pope goes all the way back to the Scriptures, to Jesus himself, and of course to Peter. The key points that I want to note about this Gospel and the passage from Isaiah that it draws upon are these. Firstly, this is the story of how Peter gets his name. Remember that he's been called Simon, that's his actual name. He gets the name Peter, which means rock, from Jesus. Now, in the Bible, when God changes someone's name, it's momentous, a change in their identity and in their vocation, the mission that they're called to. We think about Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament and St Paul in the New Testament. So too with Peter. As I said, the name change signifies something of who the person really is at the depths of their being, as God sees them. And so Peter is the rock upon which Jesus intends to build the church. Now, the word church there, when Jesus says that that Peter's the rock upon which he'll build his church, the word there is ecclesia. It means the assembly. It's the same term that's used to describe Israel when it gathered in the temple to worship God. Now, a really important detail to know about the actual Jerusalem temple was that there was a rock or foundation stone right in the Holy of Holies, in the most important part of the temple. So in a very real sense, the temple is built upon a physical rock foundation, a large rock, which was the place for the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant had been. So when Jesus is speaking and calling Peter the rock, he's really referencing the actual rock that was in the physical temple there in Jerusalem. In other words, Peter is to be the rock, the foundation of Jesus' new assembly, the church, where the people of Israel had a physical rock at the heart of their temple. Now we see that Jesus' church will have a living rock, as it were, Peter as the foundation stone. The second thing that we need to look at in the passage today is the meaning of the keys of the kingdom of heaven that Jesus gives to Peter. This conjures up images, when we talk about Peter standing at the pearly gates waiting to welcome us in. That's where this image comes from, but that's quite a trivialized kind of image. There's something much deeper and much richer going on here. The first reading actually gives us the reason for the phrase, the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and what Jesus is meaning when he entrusts them to Peter. The first reading refers to a role in David's kingdom. The role was called, like a job description, it was called al-Baith. It literally means somebody who is over the house. So you know how we speak of the House of Windsor, and we mean the English royal family? Well, when we speak of the House of David, we mean the kingdom of David and his lineage, his royal line. That's for Israel. So the al-Baith was a reference to the person that David placed in charge of the kingdom. It's sort of like the prime minister, the second in charge. In the first reading, God tells Shebna, who's been a bad prime minister, a bad al-Baith, that he's to be replaced by Eliakim, who is to be a good prime minister. Shebna's been dismissed from the role and it's been given to Eliakim instead. Now, the person who has that office, who is given the role of Albaith, where we hear in the first reading that they're given the keys to the house of David, the keys of the kingdom. The keys were a symbol of the king's authority which had been given to him. It says, "You're in charge of my house. You possess my delegated authority." Notice too that Eliakim, the prime minister, is to be a father to the people. Now, of course, the king is the true father of the people, but the prime minister participates in the king's fatherhood. And so now, to join another dot for you, the word pope that we use today is derived from papa, or father. The last thing that I want you to notice about the reading from Isaiah is that what he opens, the Albaith, the overseer, what he opens, no one can shut. What he closes, no one can open. In other words, he has the authority to make decisions, binding decisions upon the people. So when it's clear from this passage, that in Isaiah, that what Jesus has in mind in making Peter the second in command, the prime minister of his church. Because Peter's given the keys of the kingdom, he's to act as a father, and he can also make binding decisions. He can teach in the name of God as well. Now, by using this passage to establish Peter as the Albaith, the prime minister of the church, Jesus is not just doing something to Peter, but he's establishing a role, a job description for Peter, but also for those who will follow in his footsteps. We know this because the passage in Isaiah is about succession. The role is passing in that passage from Shebna to Eliakim. And so that means that Jesus' prime ministership, the papacy, will pass from Peter to another and to another. This is where we get the idea of apostolic succession, that the role of the Pope will pass to another, and not just the Pope, but the role of the 12 will pass, the apostles will pass to their successors that we call bishops. This role will continue, it will be passed on and passed on. And in the case of the Pope, right down to the present day, and to Pope Francis, who is the 265th successor of Peter. There's much that we could say about Francis, and there's much more that we could say about the papacy generally. But I thought in conclusion to the homily, I would pick out just a long quote from Pope Francis from that moment that I mentioned at the beginning of the homily, that moment back in March in St Peter's Square. I'd like you to imagine that the Pope is speaking to you as a father as you listen. This is the quote. "Thick darkness has gathered over our squares, our streets and our cities. It's taken over our lives, filling everything with a deafening silence and a distressing void that stops everything as it passes by. We feel it in the air. We notice it in people's gestures. Their glances give them away. We find ourselves afraid and lost. The storm exposes our vulnerability and uncovers those false and superfluous certainties around which we have constructed our daily schedules, our projects, our habits and our priorities. It shows us that how we have allowed to become dull and feeble the very things that nourish, sustain our lives and our communities. The tempest lays bare all our prepackaged ideas and forgetfulness of what nourishes our people's souls, all those attempts that anaesthetize us with ways of thinking and acting that supposedly save us, but instead prove incapable. We deprive ourselves of the antibodies we need to confront adversity. The Lord asks us, and in the midst of our tempest, invites us to reawaken and to put into practice that solidarity and hope capable of giving strength, support and meaning to these hours when everything seems to be floundering. The Lord awakens so as to revive and reawaken our Easter faith. We have an anchor. By his cross we have been saved. We have a rudder. By his cross we have been redeemed. We have a hope. By his cross we have been healed and embraced. so that nothing and no one can separate us from his redeeming love. In the midst of isolation, when we are suffering from a lack of tenderness and chances to meet up, and we experience the loss of so many things, let us listen once again to the proclamation that saves us. He is risen and is living by our side. So like Peter, who declared to Jesus and before the rest of the 12 that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, Francis, Peter's successor in our time, points us to Jesus too and to his cross, reminding us once more that nothing can separate us from Jesus' redeeming love.